Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book, Season 6, Episode 30. Today we're delving into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History to explore a really pivotal era. Was Britain's post-war political landscape defined by a quiet agreement, a consensus maybe? Or was it actually a much more tumultuous journey towards quite a dramatic ideological shift?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Exactly. So today we're embarking on a deep dive into Britain's political and economic journey from 1951 right up to 1979, and we're drawing specifically from Norman Lowe's insightful analysis here. We'll be navigating sort of the waters of consensus politics, looking at the challenges faced by the governments one after another, and the powerful forces that ultimately reshape the nation.
Yeah, it's a period that really sets the stage for everything that follows, into the 80s and beyond.
Get ready, then, to unpack a period that really, as you say, sets the stage for modern Britain. Okay, let's start with this idea of consensus politics. What exactly does Lowe mean by that, and how did it actually show up in Britain after the war?
Well, what's really interesting here is how the period from 51 to the early 70s, it's marked by this, well, surprising lack of deep fundamental policy differences between Labor and the Conservatives.
Despite all the rhetoric and party arguments.
Exactly, despite the party propaganda. And it wasn't entirely new. It really sort of took root during World War II when they had to work together in the coalition government.
Right.
And the key elements just continued post-war. Crucially, the Conservatives accepted Labor's big policies, things like full employment, the mixed economy, part state-owned, part private, and safeguarding, even extending the welfare state.
And we even get that nickname for it, Butskellism, coined by The Economist, which is like combining Churchill's Chancellor, R.A. Butler, and the Labor leader Hugh Gaitskell.
Yeah, just to show how close their approaches were.
It sounds like a remarkably stable period, on the surface at least.
It certainly looked that way. This consensus held through 13 years of conservative government, from 51 to 64, and then it carried on into Harold Wilson's Labor governments from 64 up to 1970.
Okay, so let's look at those conservative years first. 51 to 64. 13 years is a long stretch. They won big in 55 and 59. What were some of their key achievements, the things that fueled that famous line from Harold Macmillan, "You've never had it so good"?
Well, the most striking feature was the very real improvement in living standards for a lot of people. The government actively moved away from post-war austerity, rationing ended, building restrictions were removed.
People must have felt that.
Oh, definitely. Wages rose 72% between 51 and 63, while prices went up only 45%. So people had more money in their pockets. They could afford more consumer goods. You see car ownership just rocket from under 3 million to over 7 million. TVs went from, 340,000 to nearly 13 million.
Wow.
And the working week even got shorter.
That really does sound like a golden age of consumerism, doesn't it? But what about the welfare state and housing? Those were big labor initiatives originally. How did the Conservatives handle those? Did they roll them back?
No, quite the opposite in some ways. They actually extended welfare benefits. A good example is the Mental Health Act of 1959. And on housing, Harold Macmillan, when he was housing minister, was famously determined to outdo Labor.
Right.
He built 327,000 houses in 1953, then 354,000 in 54. That really helped ease the housing shortage. They also expanded education, 6,000 new schools, 11 new universities, and they accepted the Robbins Report, which recommended doubling university places.
So a lot of positive movement reflecting that consensus, perhaps. But were there any early signs, any cracks appearing beneath the surface? Was it all smooth sailing?
That raises a really important point. Beneath the surface prosperity, there were issues bubbling up. For starters, Churchill was 77 when he became PM again, and he left a lot of the day-to-day running to Anthony Eden.
And Eden's premiership.
It was widely seen as a disappointment, really, especially after his disastrous handling of the Suez Crisis in 1956. That damaged Britain's international standing significantly. And domestically, the Labour Party itself was deeply split, particularly over defense policy and rearmament. That really weakened their ability to be an effective opposition.
Okay, so even with Macmillan saying, "You've never had it so good," some historians later called these the 13 wasted years. What were the main criticisms of these conservative governments?
Well, the big economic criticism was their inconsistent policy, the famous stop-go approach.
Right. Explain that a bit.
Okay, so chancellors like Butler and later Macmillan would try to put the brakes on spending. That's the stop phase to control inflation and balance of payments deficits. But then, often leading up to an election, they'd stimulate growth, the go phase, with tax cuts or easier credit. This created this sort of jerky cycle where proper, sustained economic growth was held back.
So it created uncertainty.
Exactly. Take Butler's stop in 1951. On paper, it looked like turned a $700 million deficit into a $300 million surplus. But economists now tend to think this was mainly because import prices fell after the Korean War ended.
Ah, external factors.
Yes. And his measures might have actually reduced crucial industrial investment at the wrong time.
So lots of fiddling with the economic dials, but maybe not fixing the engine, so to speak. What else was on the criticism list?
A really significant one was the failure to join the European Economic Community, the EEC, when it started in 1957.
And then they were refused entry later.
Yes, de Gaulle vetoed Britain's application in 1963. Critics argue this had pretty unfortunate long-term consequences for British production and exports, missing out on that growing market.
Okay.
There was also a general lack of investment in key industries, partly maybe because the stops in the stop-go cycle discouraged long-term planning and risk-taking. And while welfare spending went up, some argue it was largely just keeping pace with population growth, not driven by a positive vision. Council housing, for instance, was relatively neglected during this period.
And then there were the scandals. Those always seem to capture public attention, don't they?
They certainly do. You had the Vassal spy scandal in '62, a clerk spying for the Russians with whispers about ministerial cover-ups. That created a really uncomfortable atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
But the most damaging, without doubt, was the Profumo affair in 1963. You had the Minister for War involved with a call girl who was also linked to a Russian naval attaché.
A huge security risk.
Massive. And compounded by the fact that Profumo lied about it to the House of Commons. These things, plus what Lowe calls an unseemly squaddle to choose Macmillan's successor, Sir Alec Douglas Home, really hurt the Conservative Party's image.
So by 1964, it sounds like despite that earlier prosperity, the gloss had worn off. The Conservatives looked, as Lowe puts it, tired and devoid of new ideas.
Precisely. The stage was set for a change.
Okay, so 1964, Labor returns to power under Harold Wilson. He's seen as a new kind of leader, seems to have reunited the party, projects this modern sort of white heat of technology image. What's his initial mission, and what challenges does he walk straight into?
Well, his first, most urgent problem was the economy. Specifically, the $800 million balance of payments deficit they inherited from the Conservatives. A huge hole in the national accounts.
$800 million.
It was massive. His chancellor, James Callaghan, had to go straight to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for loans. Now, many economists at the time said, look, you just have to devalue the pound straight away.
But Wilson resisted.
He did, strongly. He was really worried it would destroy Labor's prestige, especially since Labor had devalued back in 1949. He feared being seen as the party of a devaluation.
Right, but here's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Because despite trying everything else, they eventually do devalue the pound in 1967.
They do. And Wilson goes on TV and delivers that famous line, trying to reassure people, saying, devaluation does not mean that the pound in the pocket is worth 14% less.
Which technically was sort of true for domestic prices immediately, but it completely backfired, didn't it?
Completely. It sounded shifty, it damaged his credibility, reinforced this image he sometimes had of being a bit slippery.
And the irony, Lowe points out, is that the actual economic results of Labor's first 3 years weren't that different from the Conservative stop-go years.
No, it was essentially just a continuation of that economic stagnation. The underlying problems hadn't gone away.
One of the biggest of those underlying problems, certainly for Labor government, seems to be the trade unions. How did Wilson's attempt at reform, the white paper in place of strife, play out?
Yeah, the unions were a major issue. The economy was being really badly damaged by a growing number of strikes, especially these things called wildcat strikes.
Unofficial strikes.
Exactly. Unofficial, often spontaneous, very disruptive. So Barbara Castle, who was the employment secretary, a very formidable figure, published this white paper in place of strife in 1969.
And what did it propose?
Things like mandatory ballots before a strike could happen and a 28-day cooling-off period. Quite radical stuff for the time, trying to bring some legal framework to industrial relations.
And the reaction?
Oh, huge backlash. Lowe describes howls of protest from the TUC, the Trades Union Congress. And crucially, there was really strong opposition from within the Labor Party itself, including from James Callaghan, who was then Home Secretary.
So Wilson had to back down.
He did. Lowe calls it a humiliating climb down. He basically had to admit defeat, acknowledging reform was needed, but proving completely unable to deliver it against that opposition.
But despite these struggles, especially on the economy and with the unions, labor did have some really significant social achievements during this time, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely. This is where the picture gets more complex. They brought in rent rebates for tenants. They lowered the voting age to 18, a big change. They abolished the death penalty, created the Office of the Ombudsman to handle public complaints about government bodies.
Landmark legislation, too.
Definitely. You get the Abortion Act in 1967, the Sexual Offenses Act in 67, which legalized homosexual acts between consenting adults in private, and the Race Relations Act in 68, which made racial discrimination illegal in housing and employment. Big social changes.
And education.
Yes, they really pushed for comprehensive secondary education, moving away from the old grammar school system. And, very significantly, they created the Open University, which was revolutionary in offering higher education opportunities to adults through distance learning.
So looking at Wilson's time in the 60s, it's a real mix, isn't it? Economic difficulties, union battles, but also major social reforms. How do historians quoted by Lowe assess this period? Is it an era of lost innocence or maybe a golden age of the welfare state?
Well, Lowe highlights these conflicting views. You have historians like David Marquand who argue the Wilson years were ultimately about hopes betrayed. They feel labor failed to break out of that stop-go cycle and ended up disappointing many of their supporters.
But there's another view?
Yes. Others, like Dominic Sambrook, argue that actually their economic record wasn't all that bad when you compare it to what came later in the 70s. Unemployment, for instance, never went above 2.7%, and inflation was below 4% for a lot of the 60s.
That sounds pretty good now.
It does. And Nicholas Timmons points to really significant unmatched increases in spending on social services. So it really depends on what you focus on. Were the underlying economic problems solved? No. But were there major strides in social policy and welfare? Absolutely. It shows how complex judging these periods can be.
Okay, let's move into the 1970s then. Edward Heath, a conservative, takes power in 1970. He described himself as a one-nation Tory, keen to maintain the welfare state, but he also wanted trade union reform and less state intervention. Does this mark the real end of that post-war consensus?
Well, some historians look at Heath's pre-election Selsdon Park conference, which had a more right-wing flavor, and see that as the beginning of the end for consensus. But Lowe suggests that, in practice, many elements of consensus actually continued under Heath.
Okay.
His main goal, like Wilson's really, was to escape stop-go. He wanted to do this by reducing controls and, crucially, by taking Britain into the EEC. And getting Britain into the European Economic Community in 1973 was, without doubt, Heath's greatest achievement.
But his government was almost immediately hit by economic problems and, yet again, major fights with the unions. It seems like a recurring theme.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Inflation started to become really serious under Heath, which actually forced him into a U-turn. He ended up imposing wage restraint, something he'd initially opposed.
And the unions?
His Industrial Relations Act of 1971 was a direct attempt to put legal curbs on strikes. But the unions, led by the TUC, basically refused to cooperate and successfully defied it. Then came the miners' strike in 1972.
That was a big one, wasn't it? With the flying pickets.
Yes, very effective tactic, where striking miners traveled around to picket power stations and coal depots, shutting things down.
Right.
It forced Heath to give in to their demands, led to a state of emergency, widespread power cuts, a major defeat for the government.
And then, as if things weren't bad enough, came the Arab-Israeli War in 1973.
Yes, and the devastating oil crisis that followed. OPEC countries cut production and embargoed oil sales to countries supporting Israel.
A massive external shock.
Huge. Britain's oil imports were cut, and prices didn't just rise. They more than trebled almost overnight. This caused petrol shortages, queues at garages, and sent the balance of payments deficit through the roof.
And this set the stage for another confrontation with the miners.
Exactly. In late 1973, the miners demanded another large pay increase, partly because of the rising inflation caused by the oil crisis. Heath refused to make concessions beyond his income's policy limits. This led directly to the infamous three-day week for industry to save electricity, and even limits on TV broadcasting hours. A really grim time.
And Heath called an election in February 1974 on the question, who governs Britain, Parliament or the unions? That sounds like the consensus is well and truly over now. This is ideological conflict.
It felt like it. It was a really bitter, dramatic election. But the public, facing rising prices and power cuts, didn't give Heath the clear answer he wanted.
What was the result?
A hung parliament. Labour actually won slightly more seats, but nobody had an overall majority. Heath tried to form a coalition with the Liberals, but that failed.
So he had to resign. How do historians view Heath's premiership?
Lowe mentions that critics point to his U-turns and maybe his confrontational style. Some say he was just unfortunate in being prime minister at the wrong time, facing global economic forces and union power that were just too big to conquer quickly.
So Wilson is back, unexpectedly in 1974, but leading a minority labor government. How does he try to stabilize things, especially with the unions who had just effectively brought down Heath?
Well, his first move was to settle the miners' strike, basically by giving them what they wanted. He then repealed Heath's Industrial Relations Act. This initially led to a rush of other big wage claims, which just fueled inflation even more.
So trying to calm things down, but potentially making inflation worse.
Exactly. His main strategy then was to introduce something called the social contract. This was an attempt to get the TUC to agree to voluntary wage restraint in return for government policies the unions liked, like repealing the Industrial Relations Act and freezing rents.
Did it work?
Initially, it had some limited success in moderating wage claims, but inflation remained stubbornly high.
Wilson also held that promised EEC referendum in 1975, right?
Yes, he did. That confirmed Britain's membership with a pretty decisive yes vote, settling that issue for a while, despite deep divisions within his own Labour Party. Then, in 1976, Wilson surprised everyone by resigning.
And James Callaghan took over. Why did Wilson resign?
Well, officially he said he'd always planned to retire at 60. He was clearly feeling the strain of top-level politics. But we now know he was also in the very early stages of Alzheimer's disease, which likely played a part.
And Callaghan inherited what kind of situation?
An absolutely dire one. A huge balance of payments deficit still, inflation running at 16%, and unemployment had gone over 1 million. A real crisis.
This leads to that huge moment going to the IMF for a massive loan and the spending cuts that came with it. You mentioned this earlier as a possible turning point.
Yes, this is really significant. For many commentators, 1976 marks the moment when post-war Keynesian economics, the idea you manage demand and aim for full employment, even if it means borrowing, was effectively abandoned by a labor government.
And Callaghan's speech.
He famously told the Labour Party conference that year, "You cannot now, if you ever could, spend your way out of a recession." It was a stark message. Huge spending cuts were announced as part of the IMF deal, and Labour actually lost its tiny Commons majority shortly after, having to rely on a pact with the Liberals to stay in power.
But then things start to look up a bit. North Sea oil starts flowing.
Yes, North Sea oil revenues start coming in, which helps the balance of payments enormously. By the end of 1977, the economy does seem to be improving, inflation is falling, things looked a bit brighter for Callaghan.
So what goes wrong? Why didn't he call an election then?
That's the big what if. He decided to wait, hoping for even better conditions in 1979. Instead, we got the winter of discontent in 1978-79.
Ah, yes, the famous winter of discontent. What triggered it?
Callaghan tried to extend the social contract, proposing a strict 5% limit on wage increases. But inflation was still around 10%, so real wages were falling. The TUC rejected it, the Labour Party conference rejected it.
And then the strikes started.
Oh yes, a massive wave of strikes, especially in the public sector. Lorry drivers, NHS workers, council workers, refuse collectors, mountains of rubbish piled up in the streets. Even, notoriously, gravediggers in Liverpool went on strike.
That kind of chaos must have been incredibly damaging for labor.
Extremely. It completely destroyed Labor's claim that they were the only party who could work with the unions. With unemployment still high, nearly 1.4 million, the government just looked powerless, out of ideas. Callaghan was finally forced into an election in May 1979 after losing a vote of confidence in Parliament.
And waiting in the wings is Margaret Thatcher. She had ousted Heath as Conservative leader back in '75. What was her vision, and how did she capitalize on all this chaos under Labour?
Well, Thatcher was very different. As Lowe points out, she was heavily influenced by more right-wing thinkers like Enoch Powell and Sir Keith Joseph. She believed the country needed a really strong leader to stand up to the unions and fundamentally change economic direction towards monetarism, controlling the money supply to curb inflation.
A complete break from the consensus idea.
Absolutely. She came across as aggressive, self-confident, and she relentlessly highlighted the chaos of the winter of discontent.
And they ran a very modern campaign, hired Saatchi and Saatchi.
Yes, a very slick, professional campaign for the time. Their manifesto was clear. Reduce union power, improve public services, though how was less clear, and, very cleverly, offering to sell council houses to tenants at reduced prices. That was a direct appeal to many traditional working-class voters.
And the results?
A decisive conservative victory in May 1979. It really marked the end of an era, the end of Labour's long period in office since the war, barring Heath's term, and it ushered in a completely new ideological chapter for Britain. Old Labour, as it became known, was basically locked out of power for the next 18 years.
So if we look back at this whole period, 1951 to 1979, Lowe's analysis keeps returning to this underlying economic problem. How to get growth without inflation, how to balance the books. Britain seemed to struggle with this constantly.
It did. And a key point Lowe makes, using various sources, is that while the British economy did grow in absolute terms, its main rivals, France, Germany, Japan, the U.S., they all grew much faster.
So Britain was falling behind relatively.
Significantly, Britain's share of world manufactured exports just plummeted from about 25% in 1950 down to under 10% by 1979. Economically measured by GDP per head, Britain went from being one of the wealthier European nations to one of the least efficient in the EEC by 1977.
And the reasons for this relative decline or inefficiency are, as Lowe notes, really controversial. People blame different things.
Oh yes, intense debate. Management tended to blame the unions for excessive wage demands, for resisting new technology and working practices, leading to overmanning, inefficiency.
And the unions blamed.
They blamed it on management. They pointed to what they saw as unimaginative management, a lack of long-term vision, not enough investment in research and development, and too much focus on the easier but more volatile home market instead of pushing exports.
And the stop-go policies we talked about also get blamed.
Yes. Manufacturers certainly complained that the constant shopping and changing of government economic policy made it impossible to plan long-term investment and expansion.
We also mentioned external shocks like the oil crisis.
Definitely a major factor. That massive price hike in '73 caused huge inflation and balance of payments problems across the Western world, but it hit Britain hard. Although, ironically, the arrival of North Sea oil later on helped cushion the blow for the UK compared to some others.
Lowe also mentions a surprising cultural factor.
Yeah, he cites arguments about a certain, perhaps traditional hostility in the British business community towards formal management training compared to, say, the U.S., which might have hindered adaptation and efficiency.
So taking all this together, was Britain genuinely in decline? Dean Acheson's famous line about Britain having lost an empire but had not yet found a role, was he right? Or is that whole decline narrative a bit of a myth?
Well, Lowe presents both sides of that argument. You certainly have historians like Corelli Barnett who paint a really quite grim picture of decades of failure and missed opportunities, a narrative of decline.
But there's a counter-argument.
Yes, very much so. Other historians like Andrew Marr or Dominic Sambrook argue that while the 1970s were undoubtedly crisis-ridden, the period before Thatcher wasn't just a story of steady, inevitable slide into disaster. There were successes, too.
And George L. Bernstein's book, The Myth of Decline, makes an even stronger case against it.
Exactly. Bernstein argues that if you judge the British economy by its own historical standards, its performance in the 25 years after the war was actually exceptionally good.
How so?
He points out that the focus on relative decline often overlooks massive improvements in social well-being. Britain's performance in providing jobs, a safety net through the welfare state, and generally improving living standards for most people was, in his view, outstanding.
Interesting.
And he also notes that while manufacturing struggled relatively, other parts of the economy, like financial services and retail distribution, were actually highly efficient. So the picture Lowe presents, drawing on these different views, is much more nuanced than just a simple story of inevitable decline.
Okay, let's wrap this up by returning to our original question. Was Britain's post-war political landscape defined by that quiet agreement, the consensus, or was it more of a tumultuous journey towards a big ideological shift? It sounds like, based on Lowe's analysis, the answer is, well, both.
I think that's fair. We definitely started with this remarkable period of consensus, didn't we? Where, despite the party labels, the core policies largely overlapped. This was driven by that shared post-war experience, the desire for stability, for prosperity after the war years.
But as we've explored, that consensus was always under pressure, wasn't it?
Constantly. From internal party splits, like labor over defense, from those persistent economic challenges, the stop-go cycle, inflation, the balance of payments, from the growing power and militancy of the trade unions, and then those big external shocks, especially the oil crisis in the 70s.
And these pressures just built up over time.
They did. They gradually eroded the common ground, pushed the political landscape towards much sharper, more distinct ideological battle lines. And this culminated really dramatically in the winter of discontent.
Which created the opening for Margaret Thatcher.
Exactly. She arrived ready to challenge the very foundations of that post-war settlement, arguing the consensus itself was the problem.
It's a really powerful reminder, isn't it, that even when things look stable, when there seems to be broad agreement, there can be underlying tensions, unforeseen events that can just completely change a nation's direction. Lowe's work gives us a fantastic lens on how Britain navigated, or maybe struggled through, these really complex decades.
It really does. And maybe for you, the listener, reflecting on all this might spark a question. When you look at political landscapes today, maybe in Britain or elsewhere, can you spot areas of apparent consensus that seem to be under pressure? What forces, economic, social, political, might be pushing things towards a new kind of ideological shift?
That's a great question to leave people with, something to definitely ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into modern British history through the lens of Norman Lowe's work. We hope you feel a little more well-informed and perhaps a little more curious about the complex forces that continue to shape nations.